Sometimes secrets don't come from forgotten ruins or dusty books. Sometimes they slip through the static, just a whisper across the airwaves, not meant for any human ear. In August of 1972, one such whisper ignited the darkest story ever told in the Appalachian Mountains. That summer was thick with heat and haze in West Virginia. By day, the hills buzzed with cicadas, and by night the ridges drowned in rolling fog, pressing against the valleys like a weight of wool. Deep in one of those valleys, in a clearing left behind by the abandoned coal industry, stood a lonely geological radio outpost. A wooden shack with peeling paint, a mast strung with antennas, and one man inside, keeping the midnight watch. His name was John Merrick, an Air Force veteran who had grown used to long shifts filled with little more than lightning static and the occasional wandering voice of a trucker's CB. He did not expect the mountain to speak back. Just after midnight, the equipment shivered to life with a spike across the dial. At first, Merrick thought it was a storm building on the horizon. The sound was harsh, violent static, then a long, ragged breath, wet and low, almost animal. He leaned forward, staring at the dials, his hand moving automatically to start the reel-to-reel recorder. And then he heard words. "We found it. It should never have been opened." The voice was broken, hollow, as if forced through water or through a cracked chest. Each syllable came with a faint, grinding undertone, like rusted machinery turning in the dark. Merrick froze. He had heard thousands of transmissions in his career, but nothing like this. It was too sharp, too deliberate, and the signal ended as suddenly as it began. No carrier wave, no static, just silence so complete it felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. He switched to the backup receiver. The dials were clean. He tried the emergency channel, nothing. He rewound the tape, listening again, his fingers trembling against the buttons. The voice was there, every time, cutting through the silence. The more he listened, the more it felt wrong. Not just distorted, but unnatural, like the voice didn't belong to any human throat. Merrick filed his report before dawn, sealing the tape in a padded envelope marked urgent. By the time the sun rose over the fog-choked ridges, the recording was already on its way to Charleston. Within hours, the Geological Survey had it, and by nightfall, a copy sat on a desk at Morgantown University, where archaeologists had been studying ancient Shawnee burial mounds scattered across the highlands. The next day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation claimed a duplicate for analysis. For most signals, that would have been the end of it. Chalk it up to interference, a trick of weather, a miner's ghost story for the campfire. But this one did not fade. The tape was replayed again and again in quiet rooms by men who did not smile, who took notes in the margins, who ordered files locked away as soon as the sound ended. What Merrick had caught was no accident, and everyone who heard it seemed to understand the same unspoken truth. The mountains had spoken, and something inside them had been found. By late July of 1972, long before the signal reached the FBI, another story was already unfolding in the hills. A university research team from Morgantown had been sent deep into the mountains to survey a chain of ancient burial mounds attributed to the Shawnee. Their lead was Dr. Richard Hale, a respected professor of archaeology with a reputation for chasing fringe theories. Hale believed the mounds were more than simple graves. He claimed they marked ritual sites, aligned with constellations, meant to channel something older than tribal memory. The team of 7 men and women hiked in with heavy packs, their boots grinding on the shale paths, their tents strapped tight. Local guides refused to accompany them beyond a certain ridge, muttering that the old ground was not safe, not in August, not under that year's sky. Hale dismissed the warnings as superstition, though he noted them carefully in his field journal. The mountains swallowed the group quickly. The path thinned into a deer trail, then into nothing at all. They followed creek beds and ridges, navigating by compass and crude maps drawn from Civil War surveys. At night, their campfires threw weak light against the trees, the sound of insects so loud it felt like static. Yet, even against that wall of noise, the students sometimes swore they heard something else. The echo of movement, heavy but distant, like stone dragging across stone. Their last verified message came on August 6th. Sent from a portable field radio, it was terse and professional. Weather clear. Moving toward ridge. Excavation begins tomorrow. Terrain difficult but promising. Evidence of mounds intact. The voice on the tape was steady, calm. Nothing suggested fear. But after that, nothing. The station at Charleston expected 3 scheduled check-ins before the group returned by August 15th. Not one came through. At first, administrators blamed storms, then faulty batteries. But on August 9th, when Merrick's strange recording surfaced, the silence of Dr. Hale's team suddenly became impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, archaeologists whispered that Hale had pushed them too far into the wrong valley, the one that locals would not name. A valley lined with jagged rock where compasses spun and livestock wouldn't graze. Some said the Shawnee once called it a place where the earth breathes upward. The official response was swift. A joint search and rescue operation was organized, combining Army helicopters, state police, and federal agents. The order was blunt: find the missing team, confirm their status, and report any evidence of foul play. But among those who saw Merrick's tape, the search meant something more. The strange words caught on radio, "We found it. It should never have been opened," sounded too much like a reply. And if it was a reply, the question became simple, terrible, and unavoidable. What exactly had Dr. Hale and his people opened in the mountains? The order came down on August 10th. Mobilize. By dawn, Army helicopters were circling the ridges, their rotors scattering fog like torn cloth. The search drew in state troopers, federal agents, and even local park rangers who knew the trails better than anyone alive. It was meant to look like a rescue, but the men on board knew better. No expedition vanishes without a trace in less than a week. Not in these mountains, not with radios and supply lines. The lead helicopter cut through a narrow pass and descended onto a plateau marked on Dr. Hale's maps as the team's final camp. The pilots expected tents, cooking fires, backpacks scattered across the shale. Instead, the landing skids touched down on stone as bare as bone. No canvas, no footprints, no gear. Just a windswept slab of rock, cracked and uneven, as if something had dragged claws across it. At the far end of the plateau, they found the only feature that didn't belong. A fissure in the wall of the ridge, a narrow slit of darkness in the pale limestone. It looked less like erosion and more like the rock had been pried apart by enormous hands. The edges were unnaturally smooth, darkened, polished, as if fire or heat had licked them long ago. Leaning closer, one agent saw the outline of prints. Hand-shaped, yes, but scorched into the stone itself. The fingers were long, twisted, the palms spread wide. From within the fissure came a draft of air, steady and cold. It did not carry the thin bite of altitude. It smelled of depth, of caverns, of something vast beneath the mountain. The ranger on site muttered that he had only felt wind like that once before, when standing above an abandoned mine shaft just before the collapse. But this air was colder still, and it carried with it a faint hum, low and constant, like the echo of a machine buried too deep to ever be seen. The search team spread out across the plateau, combing for signs of the archaeologists. They found nothing. No ropes, no tools, not even the scattered scraps of food or wrappers that every camp leaves behind. It was as though 7 people had been lifted whole from the rock and carried off into the fog. When the helicopters departed to refuel, the quiet left behind felt heavier than silence. Radios hissed with static. Compasses wavered. One soldier leaned against the stone too close to the fissure and swore it vibrated beneath his palm. Faint but alive, like the skin of something breathing. That night, when the equipment was finally set up at the temporary base, the geophysicist brought along by the bureau ran his instruments against the fissure. The results made him pale. A pulse, faint but repeating, resonated through the rock at regular intervals. Not seismic, not magnetic, something else. Something rhythmic. The frequency fell just outside human hearing, but the instruments groaned, their needles twitching with each unseen beat. The official report logged it as low-level interference of unknown origin. But those present would later admit they all felt the same dread, a pressure in their bones, as if the mountain itself was ticking with a hidden heart. The fissure was not just a wound in the stone. It was a mouth, and somewhere inside, something had stirred awake. The fissure swallowed light as if it resented it. When the Bureau ordered the first descent, 3 men went in, 2 agents and Dr. Alan Brody, a geophysicist from the University of Virginia who specialized in subterranean anomalies. Their headlamps cut narrow cones into the stone, but the darkness pressed close, thick as wet cloth. The walls of the passage were marked almost immediately. Lines ran along the stone, shallow carvings, parallel grooves that branched into strange spirals. Some of them twisted into shapes that looked like eyes with too many lids, or limbs bent at impossible angles. They were not Shawnee nor Cherokee, nor any of the known glyph systems of North America. Brody traced one with a gloved finger, muttering, "This isn't writing, it's something else." The deeper they moved, the stranger the air became. Their breath fogged in beams of light, though outside it was still summer warm. At one bend, the stone was blackened smooth, almost glassy, and faint scorched handprints appeared again. Palms pressed outward, fingers splayed. Merrick's tape echoed in one agent's mind. It should never have been opened. Brody stopped, his body shuddering. He gasped, clutching his head, then collapsed hard against the wall. His flashlight rolled across the stone, casting wild arcs of light over the carvings. By the time the agents dragged him out into daylight, he was semi-conscious, eyes wide, lips trembling. Hours later, in the medical tent, he whispered only one phrase over and over, "Something inside is watching." The following morning, as the team surveyed the perimeter, a ranger stumbled on something buried beneath moss and stone about 30 yards from the fissure. It was a metal box, rusted but intact, sealed with wire. When pried open, it revealed a tight bundle of paper, bound in oilskin, dated 1949. Inside was a journal. The author was listed on the first page, Daniel Whitlock, geologist, U.S. Geological Survey. He had disappeared in these mountains over 2 decades earlier, during a survey expedition that was written off as a landslide casualty. Yet here was his handwriting, desperate, jagged, trailing off in places as if written in a shaking hand. The final entry was almost illegible, pressed into the paper as if carved rather than written. "We woke it. This is not an echo. It breathes." The find rattled everyone. The Bureau confiscated the journal within the hour, boxing it like evidence from a crime scene. Rumors spread through the camp. Whitlock's team had gone missing here, just like Hale's. Whatever had swallowed them then had not gone back to sleep. That night, as fog thickened around the plateau, the camp fell silent except for the hiss of radios. Then came a sound that none of the men could place. Faint steps, measured and careful, circling the edge of the fissure. No weight in them, no crunch of gravel, just the cadence of something moving without flesh. One of the younger agents, nerves frayed, raised his rifle and fired into the dark gap. The shot cracked against stone. For a moment nothing moved. Then a shape uncoiled from the fissure. No body, no bone, only a shivering cloud of dust, eyes glimmering faintly inside the swirl. It lingered, watching, then collapsed into nothing. When it was gone, the night was heavier still. No one dared to speak, but in the silence, every man felt the same dread. They had not found an empty cave. They had disturbed a watcher. The second descent into the fissure was ordered at noon, though no one wanted to go. The memory of the dust shape with its glimmering eyes lingered in every man's mind. But orders were orders. This time they took a stronger team, 3 bureau agents, a pair of soldiers, and a mountaineer guide who had been bribed into silence. They went in with heavier lamps, weapons ready, and a box lined with lead sheets, meant for anything they couldn't explain. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the changing light, their grooves flickering like veins pulsing under skin. One of the soldiers called for the group to stop. Something on the ground caught his eye. Half buried in dust and rock lay a small object, no larger than a pendant. He brushed away the grit, lifted it into his gloved palm, and froze. It was an amulet, crude but unmistakably crafted. A disc of blackened metal carved with lines that spiraled inward, ending in a hollow circle at the center. The strange part was not the design. It was the heat. The metal was warm, almost hot, pulsing faintly as though it contained its own heartbeat. The soldier swore and nearly dropped it. "It's alive," he muttered. But the bureau man snapped the order. "Box it, now." They slipped the object into the lead container, locking it tight. Even so, an unease spread through the group. The guide whispered a prayer in a language the others didn't recognize, refusing to touch the box. Later that evening, back at the plateau, the men swore the air around the container seemed heavier, like static before lightning. That night, while the others tried to sleep, Agent Howard, one of the younger operatives, wandered from camp. He was found at dawn, miles away near a creek bed, barefoot and shivering. His hands were torn, his nails cracked to the quick, and his eyes were wide, glazed. He repeated the same words until his throat bled raw. "It came from the roots. It moves underground." By the time they reached him, Howard was gone, vanished without a trace between one patrol and the next, leaving only his torn jacket tangled in the brush. The Bureau didn't write it up as desertion. They didn't write it up at all. When the remaining men returned to headquarters 2 days later, they found the story waiting for them. Not in any file, but on the lips of locals. Old mountaineers, whiskey-stained and toothless, spoke of a thing the Shawnee had feared. They called it the Faceless One. Not man, not beast, but something that crawled beneath the mountains, listening for names, following voices. "It don't walk like us," an old woman told one of the agents in a low voice outside a store in Beckley. "It don't breathe like us. It moves under the soil like a root, like a vein, and when it hears its name, it comes. That's why we don't speak it. That's why the old places are left alone." The Bureau dismissed the story in their reports, but the men who'd seen the amulet never forgot. It still pulsed faintly inside its lead box, a heartbeat muffled but not silenced. And every man in that camp knew the same truth. They hadn't brought back a relic. They had carried something out that still belonged to the dark. The Bureau authorized a second expedition into the fissure, this time reinforced with soldiers and accompanied by a film crew from a federal cultural program. The cover story was simple: document archaeological findings in the highlands. The truth was buried under layers of clearance. The descent was harder this time. The air pressed against their lungs, damp and stale, as if no breeze had touched it for centuries. After hours of crawling through jagged corridors, they found it. A chamber carved from the living rock, its center dominated by a massive stone bowl. The bowl was unlike anything they had ever cataloged. Its sides were covered in reliefs, twisted figures with elongated limbs and faces that weren't human. The eyes were hollow sockets, the mouths only slits, and in each figure's hands coiled what looked like ropes, endless loops that circled back into themselves. In the basin of the bowl lay a shard of stone, black and charred, as though burned by a fire older than the mountain itself. No one touched it. Cameras whirred, lights flickered against the carvings. Then, without warning, one of the operators staggered. His breath caught in his throat. A scream tore from him as he collapsed. His eyes wide, pupils blown until his irises vanished. By the time the medic reached him, he was gone. The autopsy revealed no heart attack, no stroke. His body was intact, except for the strange residue under his fingernails. Black dust, fine as coal ash, faintly radioactive, though no source could be identified. The footage was seized before it could be reviewed. Later, the Bureau's preliminary report used cautious, clinical phrasing. Object presents characteristics of a potentially unsafe artifact, capable of inducing severe psychological and physiological stress. But the men who had stood in that chamber didn't need reports. They had seen the shard glow faintly in the dark, like an ember refusing to die. And they knew the bowl was not made for offerings. It was made for something far older, and it was never meant to be found. Not long after the stone bowl was sealed and carried to headquarters, the mountains began to whisper their own warnings. It started in the valleys below the fissure, in small farming towns tucked into the folds of the Appalachians. Places where families had lived for generations and where superstition was as common as weather. Shepherds grazing their flocks on the ridges swore they heard something moving under the earth. Not the roll of groundwater or the shift of stone, but a hollow droning, like a massive horn sounding miles below their feet. One man claimed that as the sound rose, the sheep scattered in panic, throwing themselves against fences until their necks snapped. Another swore he saw it. Near dusk, standing by a creek with his lantern, he glimpsed something climbing out of a ravine. It was small, hunched, covered in mud and ragged feathers slicked black with water. Its eyes burned blue, unblinking, glowing even in the fog. He ran. By the time the sheriff's men searched the ravine, the shepherd was dead. His body found frozen in terror. His face twisted as if caught in a scream that never left his throat. Around him in the mud were prints, narrow, clawed, but too small to belong to any bear. Then came the livestock deaths. Cows were found gutted in their pastures without a sound heard by their owners. Throats opened with clean cuts. Horses vanished from barns, their tack left neatly behind. Dogs refused to enter the woods, whining at their chains until their paws bled. The first human disappearance struck harder. A woman gathering herbs near the river never returned. A group of men searched the banks until dusk, finding only her basket lodged against the rocks. Then another vanished, an old farmer who went out to mend a fence. His hammer was found by the gate, the wood still split beneath it. He was gone. By the third disappearance, fear had sunk its teeth into the town. Parents barred their children indoors. Churches filled overnight, pastors thundering about judgment from the ground itself. But one child refused to stay quiet. A boy of 9, pale and fevered, sat up in bed night after night, repeating the same phrase until his mother wept. They opened below, and now it walks above. Doctors called it delirium, but his pulse ran wild, his pupils blown wide. Nurses who checked on him claimed the boy spoke as if he were repeating something, as though the words weren't his own. The Bureau tried to contain the rumors, but the damage was done. Radios across 3 counties crackled with interference, bursts of static that broke into garbled whispers. Truckers swore they heard breathing over their CBs. Families listening to evening gospel stations claimed the hymns warped, drawn into low, droning chants. By the time the army arrived, panic had already curdled into hysteria. Roadblocks sealed off the valleys. Helicopters circled overhead. An official statement cited unstable geological conditions as the reason for the quarantine. But the soldiers stationed at the perimeter told a different story. Every frequency they tried, military, civilian, emergency, was fractured by the same intrusion. Beneath the static was something rhythmic, pulsing, as though every radio in the valley had begun echoing the same hidden signal. The mountains were no longer quiet. They were speaking, and no one could stop them. The army brought in demolition crews under cover of darkness. Officially, their mission was to stabilize a hazardous rock formation. In truth, they were ordered to break through the western wall of the fissure, where geologists suspected a man-made barrier hid something deeper. The charges went off at dawn, a muffled concussion rolling down the valley. But instead of rubble, the stone crumbled cleanly inward, like a doorway yielding after centuries. Behind it was a corridor, narrow, descending at a sharp angle, lined with slabs of stone fitted so tightly together that not even a knife blade could slip between them. The slabs were carved. Under the harsh beams of floodlights, the images revealed themselves. Grotesque hybrids of man and beast, faces with snouts of wolves, torsos with elongated arms ending in claws, legs bent backward like deer. Their eyes were hollow gouges, their mouths twisted into lines that looked like stitches, and repeated across wall after wall, etched deeper than the rest, was a single symbol. A circle with 6 lines radiating outward like a sun cracked in reverse. The air inside was dead and heavy, tasting of iron. Every step echoed too long, as though the walls themselves were hollow. The soldiers kept their rifles up, but none of them dared to fire. The silence was already unbearable. The corridor widened suddenly into a chamber, dome-shaped at least 50 feet across. The ceiling vanished into shadow, but in the center stood a single structure. A black obelisk, no taller than a man, smooth and unmarked. Its surface was cracked like cooled lava, but beneath the stone there was motion. Faint, pulsing, as if something inside was breathing. One of the scientists stepped closer, ignoring shouted warnings. He reached toward the obelisk, his hand trembling. Then he screamed. His body locked, and he fell backward, thrashing. "It's pulling me, pulling my tongue," he shrieked, his mouth open as though something invisible gripped it. When the soldiers wrenched his gloves off, the skin of his palms was striped with fresh welts, raw and blistered, though no heat source could be found. Panic spread. Radios crackled with static inside the chamber, each one picking up the same burst of distorted sound. Breathing, rasping, like wind forced through lungs too vast to imagine. The obelisk pulsed again, lightless but alive. The chamber was evacuated, the injured man carried out on a stretcher. But no one slept that night. The air around camp grew colder, their tents rattling though no wind stirred the trees. Then, one by one, men began to vanish. A soldier on sentry duty was gone between one patrol and the next, his flashlight still glowing in the dirt. A cameraman's boots were found outside his tent, the laces neatly untied. By dawn, 3 men were missing. On a crate near the fire pit lay a scrap of paper, the words scrawled in a shaking hand. It was always there. The storm did not arrive from the sky. It rose from the ground. At first, the soldiers thought it was ordinary fog, rolling down from the ridges as it often did at dawn. But this fog was wrong, dense, metallic, colored with a strange blue-gray sheen that shimmered even in darkness. Within minutes, it swallowed the entire valley, seeping through tents and choking the camp in silence. Radios died. Generators sputtered out. Compass needles spun until they snapped against their casings. Then came the voices, not from the air, but from within. Each man heard them differently, some like whispers in the bone, others as if spoken directly into their lungs. Yet the words were always the same. You knew you would come. Some dropped to their knees, clawing at their ears, though no sound came from outside. Others screamed, firing blindly into the mist. When the fog thinned enough to see, half the camp was gone. No bodies, no tracks, just absence, as if men had been erased from the ground they stood on. Those who remained staggered through the camp, pale and broken. One soldier collapsed mid-step, his heart stilled though his face bore no pain. Another was found upright against a rock, eyes open, pupils blown wide, frozen like stone. No marks, no blood, just emptiness where life had been. Panic became desertion. Groups fled down the mountain, stumbling through the fog until they vanished. Some were never seen again. Others were found days later in ravines and gullies, curled like children, mouths packed with earth. By the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing to rescue. The site was abandoned, tents shredded, equipment warped as though twisted by heat, though no fire had touched them. The fissure gaped wider than before, its polished edges glistening with moisture like an open wound. In Washington, archivists sealed the reports under classifications so deep they would never see daylight. Officially, the Appalachian operation had been terminated due to hazardous geological instability. Maps were redrawn, the valley marked as a restricted area. Civilian flights were rerouted, and state surveyors were told the region was unsafe for entry. Yet whispers escaped. Survivors, few and ruined, spoke in scattered words. One, found raving in a hospital ward, repeated the same phrase until sedation claimed him. The rock is not a door. It's an eye. And the worst part was not what he said, but the look in his face. For he was not pleading. He was certain. The official statement was clinical, almost casual. According to the Bureau and the Geological Survey, the loss of the expedition had been a tragic accident brought about by unstable terrain and hazardous weather conditions. No mention of fissures, no mention of fog. The dead were listed as victims of rockslides. The missing were quietly erased from records. Families received sealed coffins with no explanation, no viewings allowed. The files were locked away, the valley marked off limits, and the public was told nothing. Newspapers ran a single column about a camping tragedy in the Appalachians, and then the story died. At least on paper. But the mountains never let go of secrets so easily. Years later, fragments began to surface. An anonymous letter mailed to a university archive in Pittsburgh contained a single page of Dr. Richard Hale's journal, edges burned, ink smeared by water. On the margin, in handwriting confirmed as his, were the words, "We saw it breathe." Another package appeared in D.C., delivered without a return address. Inside was a brass compass, its case scratched with the initials of one of the vanished soldiers. The needle inside spun endlessly, never settling north. Whispers spread among archivists, then were silenced by threats and sudden transfers. One junior analyst who dared to keep a copy of the Merrick tape at home was found dead in his apartment. The autopsy said asphyxiation. His neighbors swore they heard scratching through the walls that night, like nails dragging across stone. The last witness to speak publicly was discovered in 1979 in a hospital ward outside Lexington. He was old before his time, his hair gone white though he was barely 40, his skin sallow and gray. When pressed by a priest about what he had seen, he whispered with cracked lips, "Not beneath the ground, beyond it." He died that night, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it might move. Over the decades, the valley itself faded from maps. Surveyors marked it only as restricted land. Compass readings failed, aerial photos came back blurred, and eventually cartographers left it blank. Locals stopped going near the ridges, stopped hunting, stopped logging. They called it cursed ground. Children were told never to say its name out loud. In time, even memory turned brittle. But the old ones, the last who remembered the summer of 1972, would lower their voices when speaking of the mountains. One man, drunk on his porch in Boone County, said it plain. That wasn't no cave, that was an eye. And once it saw us, it never looked away. And so the story ended where it began, in silence. A silence heavier than earth, deeper than stone, stretching through generations. The Appalachians remained, vast and immovable, but no one who lived there ever looked at them the same again. For the mountain was never just stone. It was watching,